do every single thing. There's multiple different constructs that you bring in for those identity capabilities. So obviously, from an authentication authorization perspective, there's Azure AD, or role-based access control. There's the cluster identity itself. And then there's actually the pods needing an identity as well. So there's a couple of scenarios that are kind of relevant for those particular requirements. But as you look at it traditionally, applications need to access external resources. And so what this is really doing is allowing the pod to use an identity to access its external resources, whether it's a storage account, a database, APIM, Key Vault, pull the secret into the pod, whatever it might be from a capabilities point of view. And so as you look at pod identity in its current state, as you're aware, this started out as an open source initiative. There is a GitHub repo that manages that. As you're probably aware, that has actually now been deprecated and replaced with workload identity. The idea and the flow that we were thinking about was essentially, do we take pod identity to GA in its current state, fixing the current situations that exist there, or do we work on the next gen of this, which was essentially workload identity? And so as you look at pod identity and its current state, we'll kind of get into a couple of different key things. This model never builds out, but the idea is that what you want to think about is that pod identity in its current state is based off of IMDS, and it's actually leveraging the identity from the node itself, and through the NMI pod is actually doing the intercept and the identity transaction on the pod's behalf. So everybody, just so you know the flow, obviously the idea is you will create an identity, you will create a pod identity binding, and then essentially now as that pod is making transactions, the IMDS requests are intercepted by the NMI pod. Just in case you're aware, this is kind of talking through a couple of different of the current implementations, but I wanted to kind of fast forward and get right into the current issues that we have. Obviously, because this is essentially pulling everything from the node, there is a concept of the NMI pods and the MIC pods. Those in itself generate a lot of issues that we've kind of been having to work through and provide mitigations for. So one, that solution, having the NMI and the MIC pods, is not native to Kubernetes. So we had to build custom CRDs on the cluster in order to deploying additional pods in order to handle that, specifically those NMI and those MIC pods. NMI in its current instantiation is there to really perform intercept instantiations so that if anybody was to bypass NMI, they could get a token from any of the identity pods provisioned on the node. So it actually introduces a security hole in the configuration. And then so pods that run on the host network can bypass NMI and now basically see everything that's on there through that IMDS transaction. So I can talk about that a little bit more as we kind of go on. And then there was actually a known race condition, right? So that since the NMI runs as a pod and there's no guarantee it runs before other pods on the node, depending on how your scheduling works, essentially there's other pod requests can actually come up before the NMI is actually running, then go directly to IMDS. Depending on the request, they could either get a wrong token or may not be able to get a token at all from a privilege perspective. And then there was a known issue that we had put out there as well. I actually did a finding for this, put this out on the AKS issue, and actually created an Azure policy to restrict this as well. If you actually did use pod identity in kubenet-based configurations, there was a known NMI spoofing issue that arose in that particular configuration. So if you're aware, there's actually a note in the CLI. If you try to do pod identity today in a kubenet-based cluster, we actually pump a note in there. Right. And so the idea is that while you can do that, it's highly recommended that you deploy the corresponding policy to block capnet raw as an example in that configuration. On top of that, one of the other key things you look at from a functionality point of view is that pod identity in its current instantiation was very OS specific. And we had built it to work essentially on Linux nodes. We had started to do the work to make sure it worked on Windows, but it was going to be a pretty long road. There's a lot of work items we had to put on the Windows side in order to make that work. So it would have probably represented another 14 or 18 months of work before we could announce this capability essentially on Windows. So as we were looking at this, we were actually at an inflection point where do we continue work and continue engineering evolutions on pod identity, or do we start leveraging the native capabilities in Kubernetes to make this more native? This obviously brings it on par with essentially the GK implementation as an example. And so really what we're talking about is now leveraging two key capabilities within the cluster, specifically OIDC and service account token volume projection. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second as well. But those two key capabilities really lend to the new architecture that we're essentially bringing forward. And so now this really lends to a model where the token or the cluster is the token issuer instead of AAD itself, and the pod is actually has the identity itself instead of leveraging the identity from the node, as traditionally it was happening. So it's a lot more native in its configuration. On top of that, because of all the attack vectors that existed with NMI and the MIC pods, those are no longer required for workload identity. On top of that, workload identity is now essentially language specific. So it works on Go, Java, Python, .NET based applications. Really, it just requires that you make sure you load the latest version of the Azure Identity SDK or the latest Go or .NET SDK as an example, have those available in your application sets. That really is giving you access to the workload federated identity capability, which allows you to inject that identity into the pod itself. So that's the reason you need to be on the latest identity set, so you get that hook inside of that SDK. And the key is that this works. We already have many customers that have private previewed this on essentially Linux and Windows-based workloads. Works really, really well. And so as you look at it, the flow is a little bit different, right? But essentially the key is that through that OIDC capability, you are essentially going through and creating a trust between the cluster, specifically the identity that that application wants to use, and the cluster and AAD, right? So you can see here in the model is step one is request a token from the issuer. Step two is get the token, and you can see the subject and the audience. The audience is actually AAD. And then there's a send token request and an AAD token for the service principal / managed identity for that specific audience, right? And then AAD will check the trust off of that identity and validate that incoming token request. And then will therefore, once that validation has happened, actually do that that issuing of that token with, you can see the subject and the audience is attached to that particular token request. And then the pod can now use that token to access external Azure resources. So it's a much cleaner model. And now the, excuse me, dry throat here. The other side of that is that when you think about it, is that one of the challenges that a lot of customers had was, as you're aware of pod identity from an automation and implementation perspective, we had all the ARM capabilities to actually lay down pod identity, right? And so then we didn't have any ARM representation, so to speak, in passing the identity into the pod, right? So that was essentially a lot of Helm chart, CRD-based implementations in order to do the full configuration. Well, now the model is much cleaner. So not only do we make this essentially multi-OS capable through the different languages, and get rid of the NMI and the MIC pod, so it's a much more secure solution. There's no longer IMDS required transactions. It's now going through OIDC capabilities, but we've streamlined out the implementation. Right. So the general idea is that you're going to go through and essentially create an identity, whether it's a app registration or a managed identity, and then you're going to essentially create a service account and then bind that identity to that service account. And then once you've done that, then you're essentially going through and establishing a trust with AAD for that configuration. And once that trust is actually established, now all the developers are doing is annotating that service account inside of their Helm chart, and then doing the deployment. And then through the pod or the workload identity webhook, we will automatically inject the annotations that are required for the audience, as an example, the issuer, into the Helm chart. And basically, so think of like automatic CRDs as an example, and then we'll basically specify that configuration out and then deploy, allow the developer to deploy the application. The key is that you notice a lot of the implementation moves onto the DevOps side to set up the identity, set up the account, set up the trust for those configurations. So now all the developers really have to do is just deploy. So before with Pod Identity, it required a lot of configuration on the identity, setting in all the annotations as an example. So now with the webhook, we're automatically injecting them on the developer's behalf. And so, like I said, as you look at timelines, this is kind of walking through from a service principal based configuration. I think I also have representation in here from an MI perspective. So there we go. So one of the things that's important to talk about is that right now for the private preview, and actually it's now an open source public preview as well, is this entire flow working using app registration. So you can actually go to GitHub. I'll make sure I share that link. I'm sure Dave was going to share that link as well. But you can go to that GitHub link and actually deploy this right now. We have probably 20 or 30 customers that have already kicked this over, got some good feedback on this. Really the feedback so far is, when is this going to go GA? Because this has been a longstanding configuration that we're trying to deploy. Now what we're working on is in parallel is injecting that workload federated identity capability into managed identity. So obviously most clusters are pretty much split between service principal based implementations and managed identity based implementations. So we have now we're now working towards the private preview of this work with managed identity as well. And so the idea is that you can build this today, convert over to managed identity, wait for you to do your managed identity configuration, or you can use this straight up from an app registration perspective. The other big thing that's going to be important to talk about is that we are offering migration capabilities. So the customers will have choice. As an example, you can just build another cluster, stand up workload identity on that cluster, and then deploy your applications in there, set up your identity. We also will allow that you can run pod identity and workload identity in parallel on the cluster, and then we'll help you do the identity transactions for your applications over from pod identity over to workload identity as well. And so all this allows for seamless upgrades because, like I said, we're trying to do a lot of the work for you. So we looked really hard at pod identity with all the limitations, and really workload identity is targeting, knocking down a lot of those barriers. So with that, I know I ran through a lot of content pretty quickly. Is there any questions on the configuration? If you want to, anybody can come off mute.
So I wanted to ask that what do we mean by when we say language specific? Is this the workload language specific or?
Yeah, so think of your application itself. So the idea is that we're essentially baking in the workload federated identity capability into the SDKs that the applications are leveraging for their identity calls. So as long as you're leveraging, the Azure identity or, like I said, the latest Go or .NET SDKs, this will work just fine. And so for a lot of cases, there's no transactions that are required. Most applications will work as is. The reason I call that out is because, like I said, maybe there's some very, very legacy old application that won't work. And really the only thing that's required to make that work is just update its SDK for its identity transaction.
Right. You mentioned .NET. Is Java supported out right now?
Yep. So essentially, it's all supported underneath the Go-based SDK, right? So Go is going to translate across all the different stacks. So I know we've had customers testing with Go, Java, and .NET specifically. I'd have to look at the list to see what else is tested. But yeah, the short answer is pretty much all the standard languages will work as long as you're running the right SDK.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, I would assume, if those questions just come off mute, I would also assume that from a timeline perspective, everybody's kind of curious about the timelines. So like I said before, we do have public preview on open source side that's using app registration. We are kicking a couple of customers over on the private preview for managed identity, essentially injecting workload federated identity into managed identity. That should run for the better part of a couple of weeks. We are shooting for a public preview in April, May timeframe on AKS as a managed add-on, and then we're targeting GA in Q3. So those are the timelines we're essentially shooting for. And so we're trying to make it really easy that if you have a customer that's running Pod Identity today, it's a short runway to get them over to Workload Identity and then deprecate out Pod Identity. So once I get Pod Identity deprecated out to a certain point, then I'll start the actual deprecation of that feature set. So essentially the only feature set that's in the queue will be Workload Identity.
When would be the general availability of OIDC issuer?
So that will be probably next month. So everything works really well with that feature set. One thing I would be curious about, does anybody here on the call from an MVP perspective have an issue with that being on by default? So one of the things I'm trying to figure out is, do we just have it as a feature flag, or is it just there configured by default? And then all you really have to do is run your AZ AKS show and you see your issuer URL. I'm curious what everybody's thoughts on that are.
I think it will help if it is enabled by default.
Yep, that's essentially where my mind's going as well. But I just was looking for a little bit of confirmation on that.
And how different is managed identity and app registration in this particular case? Right now, I could say that we create the federated credential within the app registration, but as you're just saying, like in future, there would be support for managed identity. How different would it be in this case?
Great question. So from a workload identity, pod identity perspective, all we really care about is the client ID. So as you're aware, managed identity is just a service principal under the hood. So from our perspective, it's only just the need of that client ID. So that's really the key thing. So obviously there's implementation nuances that are required from an enterprise-based perspective. That was really the birth of the creation of managed identity, to make it easier for different partner teams, different business units to be able to create identities instead of having to reach out to the AA team to provision an identity on their behalf. But once that identity is there, it's actually pretty easy for us. So if you think about it from an evolution-based perspective as well, maybe you've done the private preview and you're using service principals and you've got your entire configuration on service principals. The key is that when you look at that trust relationship and you look at the service account that is leveraging, that service account and that trust is tied to a particular client ID, right? Which is tied to that managed identity or tied to that service principal. But now you go through and you create a new managed identity to replace that service principal. The flow that you would go through is you're going to go through and then update the service account managed identity relationship, and then you're going to reestablish the trust, and then essentially that's all that needs to happen. Because remember, the app itself is tied to the service account, not to the client ID on the back end. So that is extrapolated out in the configuration. So once you flip that over, that's really the only migration that's required.
Mm-hmm.
And the good news from our go ahead, and then I'll jump in.
No, you can continue. I will ask.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is the other thing that was important as well is that, like I said, we didn't have a lot of the hooks in there for the automation. So we've now been able to automate this out from end to end. So if you want to Terraform this out, as an example, you just pump the entire configuration in and you're able to Terraform out, I said, building the identity, creating the service account, creating the trust, as an example, and then essentially deploying the application off that configuration. So that's fully automatable from end to end.
Okay. As you were also explaining about the general availability dates, hope this dates also applies to Azure China Cloud as well.
Azure what? Oh, to the sovereign clouds?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be very applicable to the sovereign cloud. So typically from a flow perspective, we don't deploy preview additions to the sovereign clouds, but part of the general deployment of a GA feature set, it will deploy all the way down to the sovereign clouds as well. So once we announce GA, it will be available in all the public clouds and the sovereign clouds. And I can actually go further and say the air gap clouds will have it as well.
Okay.
Michael, what's the minimum version of AKS that this will work on?
Any AKS supported version will work. As long as it's 1.16, essentially, you're good to go.
Okay, thank you.
You just
But that-
mentioned that. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, you just mentioned about automation, how you can automate the provisioning of the service principal. Is that documented anywhere?
It will be on the public docs, yes.
Oh,
so
okay.
yeah,
So
so if you look in the GitHub link, I'll make sure I share that in the chat. If you look at the GitHub link, it's got a new feature set called AZWI, which is a new CLI capability we had, which kind of closes a couple of the gaps. So that will funnel into ARM from an automation perspective. So that is one thing to be cognizant of. So there is a couple of different choices you have. So you can essentially use AZCLI from a flow perspective, or you can use AZWI, which is essentially very specific. And then the idea there is that because within the CLI, we didn't have a way to do the trust without doing a graph call as an example. So we wrote AZWI to handle the trust portion of that particular conversation. And then obviously also as far as creating the service accounts, right? Because we didn't have a way in the AZCLI to create the service accounts as well. So those are two things now you can fully automate those things out.
thank you.
Any other questions? All right, as you can see, it's pretty lightweight. This should be a lot cleaner solution. It's not as heavy of a feature set as Pod Identity. A lot less moving parts, a lot less room for error, a lot less attack vectors. Just a much cleaner solution, and is on par with how the other cloud vendors are doing it as well. Like I said, this is what we've been working on for the better part of 6-9 months now, and so now it's a matter of just buttoning up a couple things and then pushing this out for public consumption.
Hi, Michael. Can you please answer the question which I pinged in?
Let me get over to chat, so I can't see the chat. So let me stop sharing my screen, and then I can go through some of the chat questions. Okay, so you're asking about moving from Service Fabric over to AKS.
Yes.
Yep. No, so what I would say is we have many customers. Actually, we're probably more than half of our AKS clusters are using Pod Identity in its current state. So one of the things we did, because it's been such a long road for getting a Pod Identity solution out for the customer base, is we actually onboarded Pod Identity, even though it's in preview, onto CSS for support. So we do have many customers using this in production, even though it's not GA'd with that support in tow. And so, like I said, that's one of the key requirements that we had from a feature perspective to make sure that there was migration capabilities, because more than half of the AKS clusters are configured with Pod Identity in its current instantiation today. Yep, thanks. And I see Richard already linked in the public repo. Yep, and okay, I got the minimum version is answered. Yeah, so that's a good point. Yeah, so obviously if we do enable something by default, we will also bring in the ability to disable it by default. I think we learned our lesson on CSI storage driver as an example on that front. Yeah, and so just to reiterate as well, so everybody saw in there's a configuration for OIDC issuer. So that's already there in the AZ CLI. And so if you do enable workload identity as the example, and you haven't enabled the issuer, we will configure that issuer, because obviously that issuer URL is going to be required in order to establish that trust. And so that's part of the reason I'm thinking just having it there from a default perspective will just streamline that configuration even more. I'm unable to reach a VM. Does that apply in this meeting? What does that mean, Ross?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, hi. Okay. Hi. I didn't even know I was muted or not. No, I'm just having a issue with two of my VMs this morning, and I just saw this meeting in my calendar, so I joined. But I'm not sure if it's the right context. Basically, the VM is not healthy, and tried to restart it, and it's not still not available. So at the moment, I'm doing a redeploy. Not sure how long it's going to take, but is this something that you guys can help me with, or should I contact?
What is this? Yeah, wrong meeting. Yep.
All right. Sorry about that.
It's all good, Ross.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think Villaru is on a point as well. So it kind of depends on what your environment is. So we've had definitely a base of customers that said, yeah, we've already got pod identity. We need a solution today. We'll go ahead and go in that particular model, and then we'll convert over later. We've had other customers going, yep, based on timeline, we can wait a couple months, and then we'll go with the workload identity solution. So like I said, just do your due diligence and figure out what makes sense. And then essentially you can go from there. But the short answer is that we are trying to enable support so that you can go and deploy pod identity as it exists today. And then when you're ready, go over to workload identity when that solution is available.
Will it be an AKS add-on or a cluster extension?
Great question. So I would say for now, it will be an add-on, but we are working. It will eventually be an extension. So everything from an AKS perspective will eventually be an extension. There's just some other work we have to do, and then once we get the infrastructure in place, then we'll start cutting over the existing add-ons.
Cool. So,
But I know
just to clarify, every add-on is going to become an extension in the end. So, yeah.
That's the end state for sure. Yep.
Awesome.
That just makes it easier from an ARC perspective as well. So Bram, on the end of life for pod identity, obviously there's some nuances we have to work through, but my plan is once we've GA'd out workload identity, I'm going to look at the landscape, see what the current state is for all the customers, as far as how many customers are still running pod identity. If we're under kind of our threshold, so to speak, I will start the deprecation. If we're above that threshold, I'll work with those customers to make sure that there's not some blockers to migration, as an example. But really what we're looking for is getting everybody usage under a certain threshold, then we can start the deprecation process. Workload identity will and is going to become the standard, yes. So pod identity will die on the vine, and workload identity will be the next evolution. Yes, this is actually the public consumable deck, so I can share that. All right, this was a quick call. I don't know if he was planning on demoing it. I was not prepared to demo, but maybe next time I can actually walk through an implementation. That would show a little bit more meat. But I'm going to assume that that's what Dave was going to be doing.
It was still information also, thank you.
Good, glad to hear it. Joseph has a question?
Yeah, thank you. I tried workload identity on AKS with, I wanted to get a token to access the resource manager. I was just dealing with some APIs with some networking resources. So I got the environmental variable created in my pod that contains the token, right? So I tried to read the file and access the token. The first time it is said it was an issue with the format. So the first error I was getting was the format when I read the token from the file. And then I was like, okay, let me try maybe to clean it up, maybe remove, any empty space or any spacing. Then it accepted the format. Then it said access denied, right? So that's where I'm at. Everything worked fine. The environmental variable was created. The file contains the token. It's just like initially the token said it was malformatted. Then when I tried to clean it up, it was accepted, but I still don't have access.
So that's going to come down to the managed identity. So what rights does that managed identity have? Does it have access to talk to RM as an example?
Yeah, it was a reader. Basically, I just need to read. I think to access that, a reader will be enough. So I don't know if it is the managed identities per se, or if something that I missed.
No, it should be the permissions on the managed identity. Does that managed identity, because remember, you're issuing a token on the managed identity's behalf. So it's going to inherit those permission sets. So if the managed identity doesn't have permissions to talk, then the token definitely wouldn't have permissions to talk.
Okay, I can look into that, but I thought it was correct. So what about the format issue? Is that something, it was in a .NET Core app. I just need to read the file, get the token, and use it. Why was it saying it's malformatted?
If you have some code you can share with me, if you can send me an email, Joseph, maybe I can look at it and see. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but
yeah, that's fine. I will reach out.
Yep.
I'll reach out to you if you have the time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, everybody just stay alert. So you should see something it's already on a roadmap, but an announcement here in the next couple weeks, month or so, off of getting this public preview for workload identity out in AKS. So that's essentially what I'm working towards. Like I said, hopefully within the next 4 to 6 weeks, we should have something out.
Just one final question. Hope this also works well with pods running on ACI as well, right? Like if we have ACI connector for AKS.
Yeah, and actually that's a good data point. So with this, there's another capability that's really important here with workload federated identity. Now that identity works in hybrid cloud and multi-cloud solutions as well. So think of having a EKS cluster or a on-premises AKS HCI cluster as an example. And so now that identity, that workload identity can extrapolate all the way across the entire stack from a singular point.
Okay.
Yep, so this is not Azure specific, but this is essentially anybody Arc connected as well. Richard, hit me up offline, because that's going to be Quentin, my peer PM. He would have those dates. I know they're imminent, but I don't know the exact date off the top of my head. All right. Anybody else? All right, give everybody back 15 minutes. Everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.